There comes a moment in life when you realize something unsettling. The path you're walking is getting quieter, narrower, and heavier. People who once walked beside you are gone. Doors that were open to everyone are now closed. And the direction you're being pulled toward no longer makes sense to most. This is not coincidence. According to Ibn ʿArabi, divine selection does not begin with reward. It begins with separation. Not because others are unworthy, but because not every soul can carry what comes next. If you've felt isolated without being rejected, delayed without being denied, and tested without explanation, then listen carefully. This message is not for everyone. It never was. And by the end of this, you'll understand why only one kind of person reaches this point and why you are standing here now. Before divine selection ever becomes visible, it begins with subtraction. This is the part no one warns you about. Most people imagine that being chosen means being added to more people, more support, more clarity, more doors. Ibn ʿArabi turns this illusion upside down. He teaches that Allah does not begin by giving. He begins by taking away. When the process started for you, things did not improve. They fell apart, relationships thinned, familiar paths closed, even your own confidence wavered. You were not abandoned, you were being unburdened. What was removed could not travel with you to where you were being led. This is why the removal felt personal. It targeted attachments, not just habits. People you loved became distant. Goals you once chased lost their meaning. Certainty slipped through your hands. Ibn ʿArabi explains that this stage is necessary because divine proximity requires emptiness. A crowded heart cannot receive what is subtle. A noisy life cannot hear what is precise. Most people fail here. They assume loss means rejection. They rush to replace what was removed, new distractions, new identities, new dependencies. But you didn't. Even when you didn't understand it, you stayed with the emptiness. That is rare. That is why the process continued. Selection is not about endurance alone. It is about non-replacement. You did not immediately fill the void with noise. You sat with the discomfort. You questioned. You waited. Ibn ʿArabi says this is the moment when Allah distinguishes between those who seek relief and those who seek truth. Relief wants escape. Truth demands exposure. What left your life was not compatible with the next station. Some people could not stay because they related to an older version of you. Some paths ended because they were built for who you were, not who you were becoming. Even certain prayers were not answered because they belonged to a chapter that had already closed. This is why the removal felt isolating. Divine selection is lonely at first, not because Allah withdraws, but because everything else must. The crowd thins so the signal can become clear. Ibn ʿArabi reminds us that Allah does not whisper into chaos. He creates silence first. If you are honest, you know this lesson marked the true beginning. The moment when comfort stopped guiding your choices. The moment when loss no longer scared you as much as stagnation. That is when the selection became irreversible. This was not cruelty. This was qualification. One of the hardest realizations on this path is understanding that truth itself has weight. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that divine knowledge is not withheld out of favoritism, but out of mercy. Not every soul is built to carry certain realities without distortion, arrogance, or collapse. What overwhelms one person stabilizes another. The difference is not intelligence, it is capacity. This is why your awakening did not happen early. If it had come when you first wanted answers, it would have broken you. You were still attached to validation, still seeking certainty from people, still expecting clarity without responsibility. Divine truth given too soon does not enlighten, it inflates. Ibn ʿArabi warns that premature unveiling creates spiritual arrogance, not wisdom. So instead of giving you answers, Allah gave you endurance. Instead of insight, you were given restraint. While others spoke confidently about things they barely understood, you were kept in silence, confusion, and questioning. That was not neglect, that was protection. A soul that cannot carry truth will either weaponize it or be crushed by it. You may have noticed this pattern. Whenever you were close to understanding something deeply, life tested your humility first. Your intentions were examined. Your reactions were refined. Your need to be right was challenged. This is how capacity is built, not through information, but through transformation. Most people ask for truth because they want certainty. Very few are ready for what truth demands once it arrives. Truth strips excuses. It removes comfortable lies. It forces alignment. Ibn ʿArabi says that real knowledge increases responsibility before it increases peace. That is why only a few are allowed to receive it. Look around and you will see it clearly. Some people hear fragments of truth and become harsh. Others hear a little and become judgmental. Some turn it into identity, others into performance. You did not. You waited. You questioned yourself more than others. You feared misunderstanding more than ignorance. That is the sign of readiness. When truth finally began to settle in you, it did not make you loud, it made you careful. It did not make you superior, it made you more aware of your limits. That is how you know it was real. Ibn ʿArabi says true knowledge humbles the knower because it reveals how much responsibility comes with clarity. This is why not everyone could come with you. Not everyone could hold what you were being prepared to receive. Truth is not denied to the many, it is carried by the few. And carrying it requires a soul that has been emptied, disciplined, and made sincere. This was not exclusion. This was capacity. One of the quiet traps of the spiritual path is believing that slowness means refusal. Ibn ʿArabi dismantles this assumption completely. He teaches that when Allah intends to deny something, He does so quickly. True rejection is swift. It closes doors cleanly. It removes desire. What lingers, what returns, what continues to call you despite time that was never meant to be taken away. Delay is not hesitation on Allah's part. It is precision. If what you were asking for had arrived early, it would have arrived fragile. You would have handled it with the tools of an earlier self-tools built for survival, not stewardship. Ibn ʿArabi explains that every gift has a required inner structure. When the structure is incomplete, the gift waits, not because it is uncertain, but because it is exact. Think back carefully. The delays you resented were not empty waiting periods. They were filled with subtle construction. Your reactions slowed. Your dependence shifted. Your motivations were tested again and again. Each delay removed an assumption you didn't even know you were carrying. That is not wasted time. That is alignment. Most people abandon what is delayed. They interpret silence as disinterest. They move on too quickly and later call it destiny. But Ibn ʿArabi teaches that what is truly written for you does not disappear when delayed. It becomes heavier, clearer, and more unavoidable. The delay is the proof that the matter is too important to be rushed. You may have noticed that what finally began to move in your life did so suddenly, almost without warning. Long stillness followed by decisive motion. That is the signature of divine timing. When preparation completes, movement is immediate. Allah does not stagger. He waits, and then He opens. Those who receive things early often lost them early. They celebrated speed without stability. You were protected from that fate. What arrives late arrives rooted. It stays. It integrates. It reshapes your life instead of decorating it. Ibn ʿArabi says delay trains the heart to recognize value. Only those who wait learn how to guard what arrives. That is why your patience was not passive. It was instructional. Each unanswered moment refined how you would receive the answer when it came. This is why you are here now, listening, understanding what once confused you. The delay has ended not because you insisted, but because you became capable. It was never rejection. It was confirmation in slow motion. One of the most painful misunderstandings you carried for years was the belief that being unseen meant being unvalued. Ibn ʿArabi corrects this illusion with unsettling clarity. He teaches that visibility is not always favor. In many cases, it is exposure, and exposure before readiness is harm, not honor. You were not ignored. You were protected. When others were advancing publicly, receiving recognition, or being invited into rooms you never entered, it felt like you were falling behind. But Ibn ʿArabi, explains that Allah hides certain servants precisely because what is forming within them is not yet defendable. Attention attracts interference. Praise attracts envy. Visibility invites forces you may not yet know how to withstand. You were kept out of sight while your foundations were being set. While others built outward identities, you were being shaped inwardly. Your worth was not announced because announcement would have interrupted the process. Allah does not display unfinished work. He conceals it until it can stand on its own without collapsing under observation. This is why whenever attention briefly touched your life too early, it felt uncomfortable. Praise unsettled you. Expectation drained you. You instinctively pulled back, even when opportunities appeared. That instinct was not fear, it was alignment. Something in you knew that exposure would fracture what was still forming. Most people crave recognition because they need confirmation. You were denied that need so you could learn self-stability. Ibn ʿArabi says, "The one who depends on being seen is not yet ready to carry unseen responsibilities." True authority is built in anonymity. True depth matures without applause. Being overlooked also filtered relationships. Only those who valued your presence, not your status, remained. Only those who saw you without needing proof stayed near. That narrowing was intentional. Crowds distort direction. Silence clarifies it. When the time comes for visibility, and it will not intoxicate you. You will not chase it or fear it because you were trained without it. This is the difference between those who are exposed and those who are entrusted. What you thought was delay in recognition was actually delay in risk. Allah was not holding you back. He was holding danger away from you until you could stand steady within it. You were hidden, not because you were small, but because what you were becoming needed protection. There is a reason your trials never felt generic. Even when you tried to compare your suffering to others, it never quite matched. The shape was different. The timing was precise. The pressure points were exact. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that when Allah intends refinement rather than correction, He does not send random hardship. He sends tailored pressure. Your pain was not designed to break you. It was designed to reshape you. If the hardship had been lighter, it would not have reached the parts of you that needed dissolving. If it had been heavier, it would have crushed rather than refined. This is why your suffering often struck at identity rather than comfort. It challenged how you saw yourself, what you relied on, and where you believed safety lived. Ibn ʿArabi explains that personalized trials target attachments, not circumstances. Others faced loss, but you faced uncertainty. Others faced failure, but you faced prolonged ambiguity. Others faced rejection, but you faced invisibility. Each variation had a purpose. The aim was not to punish your actions, but to loosen your grip on illusions that could not survive the next station. What made your pain feel unbearable at times was not its intensity, but its precision. It touched places you didn't know were exposed. It removed supports you assumed were permanent. And yet, despite that, something essential in you remained intact. That is how you know the pain was measured, not reckless. Ibn ʿArabi says, Allah never wastes suffering. Every trial either corrects direction or deepens capacity. Your pain did not merely redirect you, it expanded you. It forced you to develop inner muscles most people never train. Patience without reassurance, trust without clarity, endurance without witnesses. This is why others could not endure what you endured. It is not because you are stronger by nature, but because you were being configured for a different load. Pain is the calibration tool. It sets tolerance, sensitivity, and awareness. What you can now perceive, hold, and survive was built inside those moments you wished would end. Most importantly, your pain stripped away false narratives about yourself. You discovered that you could lose more than you imagined and still remain. You could be misunderstood and still act with integrity. You could be uncertain and still continue. That discovery alone qualified you for what comes next. This was not random suffering. This was customized preparation. Confusion was not a flaw in the process. It was the process. According to Ibn ʿArabi, Clarity given too early produces certainty without depth, answers without humility, and belief without transformation. That kind of clarity creates followers, not carriers. So instead of giving you clean answers, Allah placed you inside bewilderment, a state Ibn Arabi describes as the doorway to real knowing. You were not confused because you lacked intelligence. You were confused because your old frameworks were no longer sufficient. Nothing fit neatly anymore. What once motivated you stopped working. What once made sense felt hollow. You questioned beliefs you never thought you would question. You doubted paths you had already walked. Even your prayers changed tone. This was not spiritual weakness, it was spiritual transition. Confusion functions as a gatekeeper because it filters intention. Most people want clarity so they can relax. You stayed confused and continued forward. That alone separates seekers from spectators. Ibn Arabi teaches that bewilderment destroys false certainty, and false certainty is the greatest barrier to divine proximity. Notice what confusion took from you. It took your confidence in appearances. It took your dependence on labels. It took your need to be seen as right. How? In its place, it installed attentiveness. You began listening more than declaring. You hesitated before judging. You learned to sit with unanswered questions without collapsing. This is not accidental. A soul that cannot tolerate confusion will always settle for shallow truth. A soul that can endure it becomes precise. Confusion also protected you from imitation. If the path had been clear, you would have copied others. You would have adopted borrowed language, borrowed conclusions, borrowed certainty. Instead, confusion forced you to experience rather than repeat. It made your understanding lived, not inherited. This is why you often felt alone during this phase. Confusion isolates because it cannot be crowdsourced. Others could not validate what you were going through because your process was internal, subtle, and unnamed. Ibn Arabi explains that the most important transformations happen where explanation fails. Language breaks down so realization can begin. You may remember moments when you almost escaped this state. Times you considered choosing something simpler, louder, or more certain just to feel stable again. But something stopped you. That resistance was not stubbornness, it was alignment. Your soul recognized that clarity without truth would be a downgrade. Confusion refined your sincerity. When there were no clear rewards, no applause, no assurance of outcome, you continued anyway. That proved something critical. You were not moving forward for comfort, identity, or recognition. You were moving because something deeper was calling you. This is why, when clarity finally began to return, it did not arrive as excitement. It arrived as calm, quiet certainty, a sense of rightness without urgency. Ibn Arabi says true clarity does not shout, it settles. It does not convince, it stabilizes. Confusion stood at the gate and asked a single question. Will you keep going without guarantees? You answered without words. And because you did, the gate opened. There was a long stretch in your life when you said less than you knew and showed less than you felt. People mistook that for hesitation. Some assumed fear. Others assumed uncertainty. Ibn Arabi would say they misunderstood the most disciplined phase of your preparation, intentional silence. Silence is not the absence of power. It is the containment of it. On this path, silence appears when the soul understands something the ego cannot yet be trusted with. You learned early, sometimes painfully, that speaking too soon fractures what is still forming. Words invite judgment. Explanation invites distortion. Declaration invites interference. So you grew quiet not because you had nothing to say, but because what you were carrying required protection. Ibn Arabi teaches that premature speech dissipates inner states. When a realization is exposed before it stabilizes, it loses depth and becomes performance. You sense this intuitively. Each time you tried to explain what you were going through, the words felt wrong, either too small or too loud, so you stopped trying. That restraint was not withdrawal, it was precision. Your silence trained you in self-accountability. Without external validation, you were forced to rely on internal alignment. You learned to check yourself instead of defending yourself. You learned to refine intentions without announcing them. This is rare. Most people speak to be seen. You learned to wait until you could stand without being seen at all. Silence also filtered influence. Advice lost its authority over you. Opinions stopped shaping your direction. When you are quiet long enough, external noise reveals itself as noise. Ibn ʿArabi explains that silence is the soil where discernment grows. Only in stillness can you hear what is not obvious. There is another reason your silence mattered. It broke the habit of self-display. You were trained not to convert inner movement into outward identity. Many people turn growth into a label, a persona, a signal. You didn't. You let change remain internal until it altered your actions naturally. That is the difference between transformation and appearance. You may remember moments when staying silent cost you misunderstanding. You were underestimated, overlooked, occasionally dismissed. But those moments saved you from something worse, being prematurely positioned. Authority without grounding creates collapse. Influence without restraint creates damage. Silence kept you intact while your internal weight increased. Ibn ʿArabi says that when Allah prepares someone for trust, He teaches them how not to speak before teaching them how to speak, because speech that comes too early belongs to ego. Speech that comes at the right time carries consequence. Notice this now. When you do speak, people listen differently. Your words land heavier. You no longer explain much, yet clarity follows you. That is not charisma, it is compression. Years of silence condensed your understanding. What once required paragraphs now fits into a sentence. What once needed defense now stands on its own. Your silence was not passivity. It was discipline. It was containment. It was preparation. And when the moment comes to speak fully, you will not need volume. Presence will do the work. At some point, you notice something unsettling. The number of people around you kept shrinking. Not all at once, but gradually, quietly, almost politely. People who once spoke with certainty faded. Those who were loud in the beginning disappeared when the path stopped, offering reassurance. What remained was not a crowd, but continuation, and you were still there. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that divine selection is not measured by intensity, talent, or early enthusiasm. It is measured by who remains when enthusiasm dies. Most people do not fail because they are incapable. They fail because they expect the path to feel rewarding before it becomes demanding. You did not continue because you felt strong. Many days you continued while feeling hollow. You did not continue because you understood. Often you moved forward while confused. What separated you from those who left was not clarity or courage. It was refusal to abandon the process simply because it stopped feeling good. This is where many falter. When progress becomes invisible, when feedback disappears, when effort is no longer mirrored by results, people interpret the silence as a sign to stop. Ibn ʿArabi says this moment exposes intention. Those who were driven by outcome withdraw. Those who were driven by alignment remain. You stayed when motivation failed. That matters more than staying when motivation is high. Anyone can move forward when the path rewards them. Very few can remain when the only thing left is responsibility. You learned how to act without emotional reinforcement. That is not stubbornness. That is maturity. Notice what quitting would have offered you. Relief, simplicity, a return to familiar patterns. You were tempted. You considered it. But something deeper refused to collapse back into what you had already outgrown. Once the inner shift occurred, retreat was no longer neutral. It would have been a violation of your own awareness. Ibn ʿArabi explains that once a person sees beyond a certain threshold, turning away creates fragmentation. This is why quitting felt heavier than continuing. Not because continuing was easy, but because stopping would have required you to deny what you had already become. Others failed not because they were weaker, but because the cost eventually exceeded their willingness. For you, the cost became the reason. Endurance reshaped your identity. You no longer saw yourself as someone chasing outcomes. You became someone answering a call, even when the call offered no explanation. This phase trained your loyalty not to people, not to goals, but to alignment. You learned how to remain present without emotional reward, how to keep your integrity when no one was watching. How to continue without applause. These qualities cannot be taught. They are earned through prolonged exposure to uncertainty. When people look at you now, they may assume consistency was natural for you. It wasn't. It was chosen daily, repeatedly, quietly. That repetition changed your nervous system. It rewired your response to difficulty. You no longer panic at resistance, you read it. Ibn ʿArabi says that divine trust is not given to those who move fast, but to those who do not abandon what they have been entrusted with, even when its value is not immediately visible. Others left when the path grew silent. You stayed. That difference is not small. It is decisive. There comes a point on this path where explanation becomes impossible, not because you lack words, but because words would diminish what is unfolding. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that certain realities cannot be shared horizontally. They must be lived vertically. When someone has not walked the same inner terrain, explanation does not clarify. It confuses, provokes, or distorts. You learned this the hard way. At first, you tried to speak. You hinted. You tested language carefully, hoping to be understood. Instead, you were met with blank stares, polite dismissal, or subtle resistance. Some misinterpreted you. Others tried to reduce what you were saying into familiar categories. A few reacted defensively, as if your experience threatened their own sense of stability. This was not misunderstanding. It was misalignment. Ibn ʿArabi explains that spiritual realities are not democratic. They are experiential. Until a person reaches a certain inner threshold, they can only hear words, not meaning. This is why truth revealed too widely becomes diluted or weaponized. It loses its sanctity when it is forced into ears that are not prepared to receive it. This is why Allah trained you to stop explaining. You began to recognize a pattern. The more you tried to clarify your inner shifts, the smaller they became. When you kept them guarded, they deepened. Silence preserved their integrity. Privacy allowed them to integrate. You learned that some things grow only when they are not exposed. This lesson reshaped your relationships. You stopped seeking recognition for experiences that were meant to refine you, not impress others. You no longer needed agreement. You no longer chased validation. You learned to live truth without advertising it. That shift alone marks a profound level of readiness. Ibn ʿArabi says that when Allah prepares someone for trust, He teaches them discernment and disclosure. Not everything that is true needs to be shared. Not everyone who asks is meant to hear. Guarding knowledge is not arrogance. It is responsibility. You may have noticed that the less you explained, the clearer your life became. Decisions simplified, boundaries sharpened. You stopped negotiating your inner reality with people who could not perceive it. This was not withdrawal, it was alignment. There is also a deeper reason for this concealment. What awaits you carries consequences. It will alter how you move, speak, and respond. If it were explained prematurely, others would interfere out of fear, envy, or misplaced concern. So, it remains veiled until it becomes embodied. Only then can it withstand attention. This is why Ibn ʿArabi speaks of hidden stations levels of realization that are known only to the one who occupies them and to Allah. These stations are not announced. They are recognized through conduct, restraint, and depth. You are approaching something that does not need applause. It needs protection. And the clearest sign that you are ready for it is this. You no longer feel the urge to explain what is happening to you. You are content to let it unfold, because you now understand this was never meant for everyone. One of the most humbling realizations on this path is discovering that what is given next is not unlocked by asking louder, wanting harder, or proving worthiness. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that readiness is not something you claim, it is something that is noticed. Long before you understood what was happening, you were being observed. Not in spectacle, not in public moments, but in the quiet spaces where no reward was guaranteed. You did not apply for this station. You were measured for it. Readiness reveals itself through patterns, not promises, through how you respond when nothing improves, through how you act when no one affirms you, through how you carry disappointment without becoming bitter and hope without becoming reckless. These are not traits people showcase, they are traits that appear under pressure. This is why so much of your preparation happened privately. If readiness could be requested, everyone would request it. If it could be proven verbally, it would be performed. But readiness is behavioral. It shows itself in restraint when provocation would be easier, in patience when shortcuts are available, in integrity when no consequence seems attached. You may remember moments when you were tempted to force progress times you considered pushing doors, asserting yourself, or demanding clarity. Something always stopped you. That pause was not hesitation, it was discernment forming. Ibn Arabi explains that the unready rush because they fear missing out. The ready move when summoned because they trust timing more than urgency. Look closely at how your desires changed. You stopped chasing outcomes that once consumed you, not because you lost ambition, but because your ambition matured. You began valuing stability over speed, alignment over recognition, depth over display. That internal shift is what marks readiness. It cannot be faked because it costs too much comfort. There is another sign that often goes unnoticed. You learned how to wait without resentment. Waiting did not make you passive. It made you attentive. You paid closer attention to your reactions, your motives, your patterns. You corrected yourself without needing external correction. You refined your conduct without announcing improvement. That self-governance is rare. Ibn Arabi says, divine trust is given to those who can govern themselves before being entrusted with anything that affects others. This is why readiness is recognized, not requested. It announces itself through consistency under obscurity. Notice also how responsibility began to precede reward in your life. You were given burdens before benefits, expectations before outcomes. You were asked to carry weight without guarantee. That inversion is intentional. It filters those who want the fruits from those who can tend the roots. You may have wondered why others seem to advance faster, receive opportunities sooner, or gain recognition earlier. What you could not see then was what they were not being asked to carry. Readiness is not about acceleration, it is about load, bearing capacity. What is coming next will not be light. It will require discernment, restraint, and steadiness long after novelty fades. This is why the invitation did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly, through circumstances aligning rather than announcements being made. When readiness is real, the transition feels natural, not dramatic. It integrates rather than disrupts. You did not convince Allah you were ready. You demonstrated it over time, in private, without knowing you were being evaluated. And that is why what comes next will not feel borrowed or fragile. It will feel fitted. Because readiness, once recognized, is not reversed. One of the most difficult truths to accept on this path is that what arrives next will not begin as pleasure, it will begin as weight. Ibn Arabi is uncompromising on this point. He teaches that divine favor does not announce itself through comfort, ease, or celebration. It announces itself through responsibility. Reward follows later, if at all. First comes the burden. This is where many are filtered out. Most people believe they are ready because they imagine reward first. They picture relief, recognition, or elevation. They do not imagine obligation. They do not imagine accountability without applause. They do not imagine carrying consequences that extend beyond themselves. Ibn Arabi says this misunderstanding alone disqualifies many who appear eager but are inwardly unprepared. You were trained differently. Long before you felt rewarded, you were asked to carry uncertainty, carry restraint, carry silence, carry integrity when compromise would have made life easier. These were not random hardships. They were rehearsals. Responsibility was introduced to you in pieces so it would not crush you all at once. Notice how often you were required to act correctly even when no one would notice. How often you were tested on consistency rather than brilliance. How frequently you were asked to absorb pressure without releasing it onto others. That is not accidental. Ibn Arabi teaches that those who cannot contain pressure internally will always externalize it destructively once authority or influence is added. This is why reward was delayed. Reward intoxicates. Responsibility sobers. If reward comes first, it destabilizes. If responsibility comes first, it stabilizes. You were stabilized. You may remember moments when you wondered why things felt heavier just as you were becoming more aware. Instead of relief, there was expectation. Instead of ease, there was obligation. That inversion was intentional. It trained you not to associate growth with pleasure, but with precision. Responsibility also stripped entitlement from you. You stopped asking, "What do I get?" and began asking, "What is required of me now?" That shift is subtle, but it is decisive. Ibn ʿArabi says entitlement corrodes trust, while responsibility reinforces it. The moment you no longer needed reward to act with integrity, you crossed an invisible threshold. There is another reason responsibility comes first. It reveals character under pressure. Anyone can behave well when conditions are favorable. Few can maintain alignment when carrying weight without compensation. You learn to regulate yourself when tired, to remain fair when misunderstood, to stay measured when provoked. These qualities are not moral accessories, they are structural necessities. What is coming next will place you in situations where your internal state affects more than just you. Your reactions will matter, your restraint will matter, your clarity will matter. This is why you were trained to pause instead of react, to assess instead of assume, to respond instead of defend. Responsibility without these skills would be dangerous. Ibn ʿArabi warns that unprepared elevation creates collapse. Power amplifies what is already present. Influence exposes what is unresolved. You were not spared difficulty, you were given practice. Each uncelebrated burden strengthened your capacity to hold more without distortion. You may not yet see the reward clearly, and that is by design. If you could see it fully, you might lean toward outcome instead of obligation. For now, the focus remains on steadiness, ethics, and containment. The reward, when it arrives, will feel secondary because you will already be aligned. This is how you know you are close. You no longer measure progress by how good it feels, but by how responsibly you carry what has been entrusted to you. And that is why responsibility came first. Because only those who can carry weight without applause are trusted with what cannot be taken back. The final illusion to dissolve on this path is the most subtle one, the idea that selection means superiority. Ibn ʿArabi dismantles this completely. He teaches that divine selection has nothing to do with being better than others. It has everything to do with being aligned. Alignment is quieter than comparison. It does not announce itself, and it does not compete. You were not chosen because you were exceptional in the way the world defines exception. You were chosen because you were positioned internally, structurally, ethically to carry what others could not without harm to themselves or to others. This distinction matters. Superiority seeks recognition. Alignment seeks responsibility. Throughout your journey, you were repeatedly placed in situations where comparison would have been easy. Others appeared to advance faster. Some seemed more confident, more visible, more affirmed. If this path were about being better, resentment would have taken root, but something else happened instead. You learned to observe without envy, to respect without imitation, to continue without measuring yourself against their pace. That is alignment. Ibn ʿArabi explains that every soul has a specific capacity, a precise role, and a unique orientation. When a soul moves outside its alignment, even success becomes destructive. When it remains within alignment, even difficulty becomes meaningful. You were repeatedly redirected not to make you small, but to keep you exact. Think carefully about how often opportunities that looked impressive on the surface fell apart before you could fully step into them. At the time, it felt like loss. In truth, it was correction. You were being kept from paths that would have elevated your image while eroding your integrity. Alignment protects essence, not ego. This is why the process felt strict at times, why shortcuts closed, why compromises felt unbearable, why certain doors refused to open no matter how reasonable they seemed. Ibn ʿArabi teaches that alignment is maintained through resistance. Ease often indicates drift. Friction indicates precision. By the time you reached this stage, comparison had lost its grip on you. You no longer needed to prove anything, not to people, not to yourself. You became more interested in coherence than applause, more concerned with consistency than recognition. That internal reorientation is rare. It cannot be imposed. It must emerge. This is also why humility deepened instead of pride. The more you understood, the less you felt entitled to explain, correct, or dominate. You saw how fragile the path is, how easily misused knowledge becomes harm. Ibn ʿArabi says true realization increases caution, not confidence. It makes a person careful with influence, measured in speech, restrained in judgment. At this stage, the idea of being chosen loses its glamour. What remains is responsibility to act with fairness when authority is given, to remain grounded when influence grows, to protect what has been entrusted rather than display it. This is not a reward, it is a charge. You now understand why this path could not be crowded, not because others were unworthy, but because alignment cannot be mass-produced. It requires individual refinement, precise timing, and willingness to be shaped without guarantees. This was never about standing above others. It was about standing where you belong, without drifting, without performing, without needing comparison. That is why this process was so exacting. That is why so few remain at the end. And that is why, if you are here now, you finally see it clearly. This was not for everyone. If you've listened this far, don't rush to label what you've heard. This was not meant to inflate you. It was meant to steady you. Ibn ʿArabi reminds us that divine selection is not a crown. It is a responsibility. What has been unfolding in your life was never about being above others. It was about being able to stand where others could not remain. The narrowing of your path was not punishment. The silence was not abandonment. The weight you've been carrying was not accidental. It was preparation. Do not announce this stage. Do not try to convince anyone of it. Live it with restraint, humility, and awareness. Because what comes next does not respond to noise. It responds to alignment. And if this message reached you at the exact moment it did, understand this clearly. Nothing was random. Nothing was wasted. And this was never for everyone. Carry that truth carefully and continue forward quietly.